What if the grandest buildings in your city, those with sweeping lawns, glittering windows, and Gothic spires, were never homes of mercy but exquisite traps? Step through their polished doors and the air turns cold and purposeful. A silence that tastes of iron, and before we descend into the records, they tried to bury what they kept beneath the bathhouse floors. What they spun into treatment. Hit subscribe now so you won't miss a single secret we're about to exhume. The Victorians loved symmetry because they believed order could cure chaos. Corridors aligned like the teeth of a key, wards radiated from sunlit centers, and somewhere a superintendent wrote that geometry itself was a balm. Yet inside these perfect angles lived an arithmetic of profit. More beds, more bodies, more funds. The County Asylums Act arrived like a royal seal on compassion, but accountants learned its grammar faster than doctors. Each patient became a column, each column a justification, and counties competed to build palaces for the deranged because palaces photographed better than honesty. Families arrived in heavy carriages and left lighter not only of burden but of doubt because the architecture did the persuading. Mothers wept, fathers signed, daughters disappeared, and the ledger recorded it all in the unblinking ink of admission and improvement. Two words that often meant the same thing, gone. They called it moral treatment, which sounded like kindness and looked like order. Early to rise, early to work, early to sleep, a sermon of routine that shaved off moods the way a whetstone shaves steel until personalities grew smooth enough to stack like identical bricks. The chair sits alone in a white room, wooden, polished, innocent, in the way a needle on a velvet cushion is innocent. Its straps smell of tanned leather and soap, and when the crank begins its prayer, you learn that the room is not a room but a horizon that won't stay still. Doctors time the rotations with a watch and with your breath. The air grows thick, the ceiling tilts into a wheel, and someone writes, pupils dilated, agitation subsiding as if you were a storm. The barometer finally understood, not a person learning to fear invisible hands. Hydrotherapy whispers the tiled corridor and water answers like a choir. Heat that steals your breath, cold that steals your voice, sheets that tighten as they dry until the word comfort feels like an inside joke and the clock on the wall sings one note for hours. The airing court promises fresh air and discipline in the same syllable. A square of sky, a perfect circle of walking lips zipped shut while birds practice a freedom too small to prosecute and a guard's boots measure obedience in steps per minute. Night is when the building remembers. Keys murmur in their sleep pipes, clank like distant rails, and dreams bloom in the dark only to be harvested by footsteps, because even silence must punch a time card in a place that believes stillness is the nearest cousin to cure. The Kirkbride asylums rose across America like competing cathedrals, each city boasting taller towers and wider lawns, as if beauty could mask the screams that soaked into their walls. Civic pride smiled on the outside while despair was folded neatly into the architecture itself. Within those walls, the line between treatment and punishment blurred until it vanished. A patient who protested might find themselves strapped to a tranquilizer chair for hours. Their cries labeled as therapeutic crisis, their silence as progress. Visitors were sometimes permitted, but only when the institution wanted to show its most orderly face. Families were guided through gleaming corridors, while the true wards, the overcrowded dormitories reeking of sweat and despair, remained locked and invisible. The physicians lived like nobility in residences on the grounds gardens. Tended servants employed while their patients slept on straw mattresses that stank of mildew. The very soil grew rich with roses from the labor of hands that would never be free again. Money carved the sharpest divisions. Wealthy patients dined on meat and fine bread, sipped tea from porcelain, while the poor gnawed crusts their bowls filled with gruel so thin it seemed more memory than meal. Survival itself was stratified by class. Hydrotherapy baths turned into marathons of endurance. Some were plunged into near-freezing tubs until lips turned blue, others wrapped in boiling hot cloth until blisters blossomed on their skin, and attendants wrote improvement in careful script as life ebbed away. Records show that in some institutions, nearly a third of patients in continuous baths developed pneumonia, but rather than condemn the practice, Administrators pointed to these deaths as evidence that the truly incurable had been filtered out. The airing yards were designed like cages for human animals. High walls cut off the horizon windows watched from above, and patients walked in endless circles. Conversations, forbidden hope slowly eroded with each turn of the gravel path. At night, the darkness pressed like another restraint. Screams from distant wards never ceased blending into lullabies of terror, and the lucky ones learned to fall asleep to the chorus of agony as though it were nothing more than rain on the roof. Death was often the only discharge. Certificates read natural causes when neglect and brutality were the true culprits, and families received polite letters filled with lies about peaceful ends, while the asylum ledger quietly erased another name. Beneath the polished rhetoric of medical progress lay a simple truth. Asylums were warehouses of human inconvenience, and each new diagnosis was another padlock forged to keep society's misfits out of sight and out of mind. The diagnostic manuals of the age read more like moral codes than scientific guides. Hysteria, melancholia, moral insanity, terms so elastic they could stretch to fit almost any behavior that made families uncomfortable. A daughter refusing her arranged marriage might be confined as hysterical, a grieving mother labeled melancholic, and in each case the asylum became not a place of healing, but of erasure, burying individuality beneath the language of illness. Physicians defended their methods with scholarly poise, publishing journals that praised spinning chairs and hydrotherapy as cutting edge, while patient testimonies letters, smuggled or whispered, told of torture that wore a doctor's smile. One such testimony described the wet sheet pack. At first, the cold steals your breath. Then, as it dries, it grips tighter and tighter until you feel the earth itself is folding you into its grave. These treatments became the theater of cruelty in which young medical students were the audience. They watched bodies convulse, skin split, minds fracture, and took notes as if cataloging plants in a botanical garden. Behind the locked doors, the asylum transformed into a laboratory where experiments were written in blood and measured in obedience, each new procedure less about cure and more about demonstrating power. Even meals became instruments of control. Patients had exactly 15 minutes to eat their thin gruel under the gaze of guards, and those who hesitated were struck or denied food. Until the next day, hunger itself pressed into service as medicine. Letters to the outside world were censored or destroyed, ensuring that families only saw the facade of care while patients inside learned the most terrifying lesson: the truth could scream forever within these walls and never reach the world beyond. And yet for the men in charge, the system was triumph. Funding flowed, reputations flourished, and careers were built on the quiet suffering of thousands whose only crime was to be inconvenient, different, or simply unwanted. By the late 19th century, Britain alone operated over 100 asylums housing nearly 90,000 souls, and each was a self-contained empire where the superintendent reigned as king, his word law, his authority unchecked. These doctors lived in mansion-style homes on the very grounds where patients rotted their gardens, flourishing with roses nourished by laborers who had once been free men and women but were now labeled incurable. The contrast was obscene, glittering dining rooms with chandeliers above for the physicians, and below wards where the sick lay on straw shivering under thin blankets, the air heavy with mildew and the smell of despair. In this world, recreation meant pacing in a barren yard, watched by guards perched like hunters in towers, ready to club or even shoot if anyone dared to approach the walls. Exercise transformed into ritualized humiliation. Solitary confinement. The strong room stripped patients of clothes of dignity, of humanity. 6 feet by 8, no windows, food shoved through a slot, waste festering on the floor, and silence so loud it cracked the mind like glass. The asylum's very routine was an act of slow-motion violence rising at 5, with the clang of keys scrubbing with caustic soaps until skin burned raw, working until exhaustion collapsed you, and collapsing only to be beaten for weakness. Physicians defended all this as moral treatment, claiming discipline and order restored sanity. But behind the rhetoric lay a darker truth. Obedience was the only cure they sought, and obedience they could manufacture with terror. The spinning chair, the ice bath, the wet sheets, the endless inspections. Each became chapters in a single doctrine to break the human spirit until it no longer resisted, until individuality itself dissolved into silence. And still society applauded, Newspapers wrote of grand new hospitals. Architects celebrated their designs, and families comforted themselves with the belief that their relatives were being helped in places that looked like castles of care. Yet within those castles, every scream, every sob, every final breath testified to the opposite, that the Victorians had turned compassion into commerce and human suffering into an industry that thrived on keeping its prisoners forever. The asylum business did not stop at confinement. It thrived on experimentation, where patients were reduced to specimens, their bodies catalogued like tools to sharpen careers and reputations in the medical elite. Dr. Henry Cotton in New Jersey believed madness came from infected organs, and so he cut teeth, tonsils, colons, gallbladders, 11,000 surgeries in total, killing nearly a third of his patients, yet still celebrated in journals as a pioneer. In Philadelphia, Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell devised the rest cure, confining women to beds with milk and crackers, forbidding them to read, write, or even sit up. What began as treatment often ended as despair, a slow descent into insanity created by the very doctor claiming to cure it. Across the Atlantic, Dr. John Buck in Ontario invented restraining devices, quieting beds that acted as coffins with air-holes chairs that held patients motionless for weeks. Each new design presented proudly at conferences while patients wasted away inside them. Children were not spared. Dr. Isaac Curlin sterilized over 200 minors at the Pennsylvania Training School, claiming he was protecting society from future degeneracy, a philosophy that would later echo in the horrors of Nazi eugenics. In Massachusetts, Dr. Pliny Earle practiced shock without electricity, staging false executions and sudden terrors to break patients into submission, writing that the therapeutic scare produced obedience more reliably than kindness. These doctors weren't fringe figures. They were leaders of their profession, publishing papers, training students, and shaping the very future of psychiatry while building empires of suffering from the silence of the voiceless. Corruption ran deep. Superintendents siphoned funds meant for food and care into their own estates, while medical suppliers paid kickbacks for contracts. In New York, investigators discovered nearly 40% of asylum budgets had been stolen. Yet when questioned, doctors defended their luxuries as necessary to attract quality professionals, arguing that their mansions and banquets were justified while their patients starved and froze in the shadows of their opulence. And the most chilling truth was, this they believed themselves righteous, convinced that suffering was an acceptable cost for progress, that their cruelty was not cruelty at all but a stepping stone on the path of science. By the dawn of the 20th century, the asylum system had become an empire of shadows, housing tens of thousands whose names vanished into ledgers each entry, another candle snuffed out beneath the weight of bureaucracy. Official statistics recorded patients as improved, chronic, or deceased, yet behind these sterile words were broken bodies, fractured minds, and families who would never again hear the voices of their loved ones. For the wealthy, private asylums offered manicured lawns, music lessons, and genteel routines. But for the poor, the county institutions resembled prisons, overcrowded, understaffed, and dripping with the damp stench of neglect. Class determined not only comfort but survival itself. A rich man might walk the gardens with a book in hand while a pauper slept among lice, his cough echoing unanswered through the stone corridors. Discharge rates told the cruel mathematics of profit. Only 15% ever walked out alive. And most of those carried permanent scars, some physical, many invisible, all irreversible. For those who remained, the daily rhythm was a slow erasure. Sunrise meant labor. Mealtime meant hunger, and nightfall meant listening to the chorus of suffering that blended into the architecture like wallpaper. The buildings themselves became accomplices. Thick walls swallowed screams, barred windows denied hope, and lofty spires mocked the imprisoned with glimpses of heaven they would never touch. Visitors often marveled at the grand exteriors, calling them testaments to civilization's progress, never realizing that within civilization had constructed its own dungeon and given it the name of medicine. The very beauty of these Gothic palaces was a lie, a mask so convincing that even those who commissioned them believed compassion could be built from brick and stone, while inside compassion was the one thing carefully extinguished. And so the asylums endured, majestic, admired, and endlessly funded, while the people trapped inside them dwindled into whispers, their lives consumed by a system designed never to let them leave whole. When the 20th century finally turned its gaze upon these institutions, the truth seeped out like a draft through cracked stone: the mortality rates, the testimonies of survivors, the endless ledgers of names that vanished inside and never returned. Reformers spoke of change, yet even as words like compassion and modern science filled reports, the reality for patients was still chains disguised as treatment, silence branded as progress. The arrival of psychosurgery marked a new frontier of horror. Lobotomies swept across Europe and America, and the asylum became a factory of damaged minds where compliance was counted as cure. Doctors wielded ice picks through eye sockets, and state hospitals bragged of higher discharge rates while quietly releasing people whose very identities had been butchered away. Mary Hammett, a young mother, was lobotomized for worrying too much about her children. When she awoke, she no longer recognized them, and her calm was recorded as success, her grief erased along with her voice. By the 1960s, deinstitutionalization emptied many of the old buildings, but the walls did not forget the echoes of screams. The weight of secrets and the architecture of obedience still lingered in every corridor. Some asylums became universities, hotels, or luxury apartments. Their spires still admired their bricks, scrubbed clean, yet beneath the polished floors lay a history that could never truly be sanitized. The legacy of Victorian psychiatry persists in subtler forms: forced medication, solitary confinement treatments that value compliance over dignity, systems that still measure human worth in economic terms. The most terrifying lesson is not that cruelty once hid behind beautiful facades, but that cruelty always learns new disguises. Yesterday it was the spinning chair and the ice bath. Today it may be something that wears the name of progress. And so we must ask ourselves, what horrors are we overlooking now because they arrive dressed in benevolence? What castles of care are we still building while those trapped inside whisper for someone, anyone to truly listen?